Chapter 9. When they released him the following morning, unable to hold him through lack of evidence, MacLeod felt distinctly ragged. Throughout the night, he had stuck to the same story. He was an antique dealer called Nash, who had gone to the garden to see the wrestling, had become bored with the fight, had used the elevator on the far side of the garage. He hadn't heard anything, nor seen anything out of the ordinary. Since the route from the elevator did not take him through the area where the body had been found, they couldn't hold him. Not without more evidence. MacLeod wondered whether they would put a tail on him, but after 3 blocks, he was sure that no one was following. They probably thought they had the murder weapon, though he knew they would be puzzled about the lack of blood. A killer might stop to wipe the blade, but would he also smear oil on it afterwards? The next thing he had to do was retrieve the samurai sword from the overhead ducting before they decided to go back for another look around. He took a cab to the garden and went down the ramp. There was someone in a car, but they drove away after a few moments. He went to the ducting and reached up. The sword was still there, with the sheath. He strapped it to his back and then put on his raincoat. He was just preparing to leave when someone in high heels came clipping along the empty aisle. Instinctively, MacLeod ducked behind a pillar in the near darkness and waited. It was a woman in her late 20s, early 30s, and there was something about her movements which made him stay hidden. She seemed to be looking for something, her eyes scanning the floor and walls. She went to the place where the body had been found and stared at the spot for a few moments. Then she glanced at the pillar next to it. She stepped up to it and ran her fingers along the corner. The hands stopped and the nails scratched at something. She dipped into her bag and came out with a pair of tweezers and dug into a crack. He saw something which glinted, slipped into a plastic bag. MacLeod knew that she had found the place where the samurai sword had been embedded after the fight the previous evening. Who the hell was she? A cop? She held up the plastic bag and clicked on a cigarette lighter, studying the contents. He knew then what she had found. Pieces of metal from the blade of his sword. No doubt there had been other fragments on or around the body of Faisal. Perhaps someone had been studying them in a lab while he was undergoing questioning. Surely they could not tell them anything. Or could they? As she prepared to leave, MacLeod crept around the base of the pillar and something crunched beneath his foot. He cursed silently. A Coke can. Probably the same one he had trodden on the evening before. What the hell was it doing? Following him around?
"Who's there?"
Her voice had a tremor to it, and MacLeod could see her pale face in the dim light. She looked scared.
"Is there anyone there?"
She called, her voice echoing in the empty garage. He kept perfectly still. The Coke can had still wedged between his foot and the concrete floor. After a while, he heard her footsteps hurrying down the garage. When she reached the base of the ramp, she turned again and stared back. Then she was gone, out into the street. MacLeod hurried after her. Once on the street, he looked first left, and then, not seeing her, right. She was just turning a corner, and he raced through the crowds of shoppers. At the corner, he almost skidded to a halt. She was immediately beyond it, buying a paper from a newsstand. Then she walked off briskly, crossing the road to the subway. He tailed her back to her apartment. That evening, MacLeod returned to where she lived, intending to knock on her door with the excuse of mistaking her apartment for someone else's. But as he approached the entrance hall, she was just coming out. She looked very attractive, but he tried not to let that bother him. He stayed close to the wall while she hailed a cab, and he heard her say to the driver, "Take me to P.J. Clark's." He took the next cab that came along to the same place. When he entered the restaurant, she was sitting at the bar, evidently having just arrived, since there was no drink in front of her. He took a stool about 4 down from her. She called out to the bartender, "Hey, Phil." "Hey, Brenda." The young guy behind the bar walked down to her, wiping a glass on a cloth. "Usual?" he said. The woman called Brenda nodded. "Lots of it." Phil took down a bottle and began pouring into a long glass. "Say when." "When?" She began drinking. Phil then went to attend to MacLeod. He called over his shoulder, "Excuse me a minute, Brenda." Then to MacLeod, "Glen Moran?" "Right," replied MacLeod. As Phil turned away, MacLeod said softly, "Go to the garden often?" Phil turned. "What did you say?" Almost simultaneously, Brenda said, "What did you say?" MacLeod was amused at the apparent confusion. He didn't know why. Perhaps, after the previous evening, the slightest hint of humour in a situation was grabbed by him for light relief. He didn't want to analyse it too closely. It just seemed funny. Said Brenda. MacLeod took a sip of his drink. Brenda picked up her bag and walked along the bar to him. "What did you say?" He turned and looked into her eyes. They really were quite remarkable. "Madison Square Garden. Do you go there often?" She looked a little perplexed and then slightly alarmed. "Why?" "Basketball, the circus, wrestling?" She turned as if to go and then halted, facing him again. Someone else had entered the bar, and he supposed she felt safer with another person on their side of the bar. "Why are you asking me about the garden? Have you been following me?" MacLeod smiled. "I'd like to walk you home, Brenda." She reached into her bag and threw a note on the bar. "I can take care of myself," she snapped. Then she strode towards the exit. MacLeod finished his drink in one large swallow and followed her out. He saw her look quickly behind her and then hurry on. MacLeod went in the same direction, weaving through the people in the street. Someone brushed against his shoulder and said, "Hey, man!" MacLeod ignored the remark, and at the end of the block, he stopped and went back to the restaurant. He went up to Phil and ordered another drink. As Phil was pouring it, he said casually, "Nice-looking woman." "Who?" MacLeod took a sip of his whiskey and nodded towards the door. "Brenda." Phil said, "Oh, sure, Brenda." "Is she, unattached?" Phil shrugged. "Who knows? One of the cops downtown maybe got his eyes on her." "She worked there?" "Yeah, some kind of lab assistant or something. You know, little glass tubes and bits of body hair. Gives me the creeps when I think of it. You know what I mean? Where have those hands been, man? She's okay, though. I like her." MacLeod nodded, finished his drink, and left.